President Biden, peppered with questions about immigration, voting rights at his first press conference last week, not a single question about COVID vaccines or the coronavirus. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. When Joe Biden took office in January, he had four major crises on the front burner: the COVID pandemic, a battered economy, racial inequalities, and climate change. But as they say in those TV infomercials, wait, there's more. A surge of migrants, many unaccompanied children, has overwhelmed facilities to shelter them. Critics say Biden's team was unprepared for a predictable situation. What can the administration do about it? Two mass shootings in 2 weeks, 18 dead, raising calls for gun safety reforms. Is bipartisan action on this hot button issue even possible? And Georgia passes a major law limiting voting rights, with dozens more states considering similar bills. Think about this: it's now illegal in Georgia to give water to someone waiting in line to vote. Biden called it Jim Crow law, but is he ready to fight for change to Senate filibuster rules so a voting rights bill can pass? And meanwhile, the president's next big agenda item is an infrastructure bill with substantial tax hikes to pay for it. Will his solid poll numbers, 53% job approval in a Reuters Ipsos poll, give him the political capital and political muscle to prevail in these battles? Or will GOP obstruction stall his plans to go big and go fast on a historic agenda? We're joined by Peter Baker, the Times' chief White House correspondent, and Reid Epstein, the Times' political correspondent. And welcome to both of you. Peter, we saw some bipartisan action on the Paycheck Protection Bill, something that will help small businesses, with everyone is in favor of. Is there likely to be any bipartisan support on the rest of the president's immediate agenda?
It doesn't look like it in the short term. Right now, obviously, this is a very, very polarized Washington, a polarized Congress. Remember, this is a Congress where the Democrats control the slightest of majorities. They have a 50-50 Senate with a tie-breaking vice president. They have only a few votes in the House as well. And these are big things that President Biden is talking about doing, big things with very small margins. And I think that that's going to be a huge challenge for him. There doesn't seem to be much of a window at this point for bipartisan agreement on almost any of these issues. You can imagine why or how they could come together on something like infrastructure. Republicans and Democrats alike have building bridges and roads and other things in their districts and states they'd like to get fixed up. But it's such a large price tag, and it comes with the tax increases, that it's hard to see how you could build, a 60-vote majority in the Senate for that. So I think he's got a big rough road ahead for him on some of these big ticket items he's pushing.
Reid, what about voting rights? The Democrats proposed H.R. 1 when they were in the minority, and it was a big package, a big wish list. Now they're in the majority, and can they really pass all of this? Do they want to pass all this? And is the president in favor of all of this, or is he willing to accept less?
I mean, it depends on which Democrats you talk to, for sure. There is a realization in the party that Republicans, particularly in states where Republicans control the legislature and the governor, like Georgia, we saw already last week. We're seeing things move forward in Florida and Texas and elsewhere, where Republicans are looking to cut voting access for wide categories of people, particularly people of color and people who live in urban areas. And Democrats realize that the only really broad solution for this is federal action, given that they are powerless in a lot of these states. The question is, are they willing to either blow up or diminish the filibuster rules that require 60 votes? Because there is essentially no prospect for cooperation among Republicans to pass any sort of voting rights expansion in the Senate. And so we've heard from people like Senator Warnock in Georgia talking about a carve out for voting rights, Senator Klobuchar in Minnesota, who's among those who wants to eliminate the filibuster altogether. And we'll see where this goes. And in the end, they need 50 Democratic votes in the Senate. And there's not, so far, Senator Manchin in West Virginia has said that he's not willing to support lowering the threshold to pass this type of legislation.
Peter, we had a story in the Times the other day that was sort of fascinating. It changed, as the president said, in the paradigm. He's quietly undercutting the very brand of center lane politics that he worked so hard to enshrine as a senator, looking for big ambition rather than the accommodation that he was known for. Is he going to be able to pull that off? And is this kind of looking at a broader constituency? Is this a change in philosophy, a change in political position, or kind of looking more at his legacy as president?
Yeah, it is striking that President Biden, who has had over the course of a long career in Washington an unerring instinct for the middle of his party, has moved so far to the left in terms of his ambition. He, in some ways, has repudiated the last two Democratic presidents and their caution or centrism, depending on how you want to approach it. He, the approach to Biden, Clinton's approach toward welfare, toward shrinking the era of big government and all of that has been thrown out the window. Obama's caution in limiting how far he was willing to go with some of his programs in order to hopefully build some bipartisan support that wasn't there anyway. That's out the window. And so you see in Biden an embrace of the argument that you've heard on the progressive left for a while, that Democrats have been too unwilling to push far enough. And I think in that way, Biden is at the moment anyway, positioning himself to be probably the most progressive or liberal president we've seen since LBJ. Now, does that mean he can get anything through? LBJ had big Democratic majorities. President Biden does not. And I think that, as Reid said, obviously, there's a real question as to whether to get rid of the filibuster. Frankly, even if they got rid of the filibuster, there's a question as to whether they could push some of this stuff through, because they would have to, in the Senate, get every single Democrat to agree to every single piece of legislation that they're talking about. And as Joe Manchin has made clear, he's not on board with everything that they would like to do. So Biden has big aspirations, but he has big obstacles to get to where he thinks he wants to go.
Peter, how is the left wing of the party, the Democratic Party, reacting to Biden's agenda, Biden's new paradigm?
Well, I think they're cheered by his support for sticking with a large COVID relief program, with sticking with a large infrastructure and climate kind of program. They're annoyed or disappointed or disenchanted with him for basically suggesting that gun control is not going to be a big priority of his. That's a concession to the reality of the votes in the Senate on the part of the president. They didn't like it when he said at his press conference that timing is everything, and essentially made it clear that infrastructure was his bigger priority than gun control. There's a lot of identity politics going on right now in the Democratic Party that's really complicated, in terms of who gets what appointment. You saw Senator Duckworth said she wouldn't vote for any of President Trump, any Biden's appointments, unless there was some Asian American representation at the highest levels. There's a real frustration on the part of her and a lot of her colleagues on that. So the identity politics is really complicating things for President Biden right now. But broadly speaking, he's got a lot of support among Democrats, and he's got support, as you point out, with the broader public. Whether that translates into power in Washington, that's a bigger question, and I'm not sure it does as much as it used to.
Reid, speaking of identity politics, we've seen a number of Black groups, Black leaders complain that corporate America was very vocal about racial justice. Some of the people sort of wrote that off as platitudinous, but they're not as vocal on voting rights. Why is that?
Well, a lot of the corporate America are Republicans, frankly, and we have seen on issue after issue, whether it was LGBT rights or the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, that corporate America moves, frankly, when it begins to affect their bottom line or when they think it will affect their bottom line. The Georgia voting rights legislation, the big Fortune 500 companies that are based in Atlanta, it hasn't been made clear to them that this is a financial or political problem for them, which is why I think we've seen them be slow in addressing it. Now, frankly, on Wednesday morning, we saw a Delta CEO called the voting law unacceptable and an affront on their employees and customers. We'll see whether that translates into any sort of action from them or from some of the other Atlanta-based companies. But I think we won't necessarily see any big movement from these companies until they start to feel it financially, or until employees within those companies start to act on it. That tends to be how we see what leads to some of these corporations getting involved in these types of political questions.
Peter, on the question of immigration, we mentioned earlier the Biden administration was caught unawares by a surge of immigrants. Why were they surprised, and what are they going to do about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. They should have been surprised if you believe what President Biden said, which is this is a seasonal increase that we see every year. If that's the case, then why weren't they ready for it? But look, it's a new administration. They had a lot on their plate coming in. They have a pandemic and economic crisis to confront. They obviously we're still trying to get staffed up. People are still being appointed and put in important positions. Obviously, to the extent that President Biden's own more welcoming rhetoric about immigration encouraged people to come was probably foreseeable, and yet obviously not something that the facilities were ready for. What President Biden would tell you is, look, we're having to rebuild an immigration system that was basically torn down, as in his view, under President Trump, and he liked to blame, of course, his predecessor. But there's a real problem right now at the border, and his own vice president now has called it a huge problem. His own Secretary of Homeland Security has said that this is going to be the largest surge of migrants we've seen in 20 years. And they're not ready for it. He's trying to, find more bed space in places like Army bases and other federal facilities. But the bigger problem right now is how to keep people from heading to the border in the first place who aren't going to be, able to cross legally.
Reid, if we have such a partisan divide and such a tiny margin in the Senate, walk us through, if you will, how the Democrats can possibly get rid of the filibuster.
Well, they only need 51 votes to get rid of the filibuster. They would need every Democratic senator plus the vice president to vote to lower the threshold to pass, whether it's all legislation or particular types of legislation. We've already seen them do this on judges. Democrats did it in 2013 on judges. Republicans did it for Supreme Court judges when Donald Trump became the president. And so the process is fairly simple. It's just whether there are 51 votes for that, and at the moment they're not. Whether there will be in the future seems a bit of an open question, but it seems unlikely that they'll get 51 votes to lower the threshold on all legislation. They may get a narrow carve-outs for things like voting rights.
And constitutionally, can they limit it to something like voting rights per se?
Well, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's a piece of Senate rules that have been enacted through the years. Largely, it was sort of most famously during the civil rights era to try to block civil rights legislation by Southern senators. And so it's something that senators can do. It's their chamber. They can set the rules however they want, if presuming they get 51 votes to do it.
Peter Baker, tell us about Lady Bird Johnson, who we sort of envisioned, as I remember correctly, as one of those kind of nice, smiling first ladies. You now tell us in the Times she was a lot more than that.
Yeah, there's a new biography out of her by Julia Zweig, and it's actually quite fascinating. She's gone through all of Lady Bird Johnson's tape-recorded diary entries from her time in the White House, some of which were released soon after she left, but a lot of them were kept quiet or kept closed until only recent years. And it does sort of produce a portrait of a First Lady who was much more of a political partner of LBJ than we, I think, perhaps fully realized, that she was helping him make big decisions, including whether to even run again for office in 1964 and then 1968. She put out a strategy memo that would be the kind you would see from a Karl Rove or a David Axelrod for her own husband, mapping out how he should look at his presidency. So I think that that's a real revealing portrait in this new book. It's called Lady Bird Johnson and Hidden in Plain Sight by Julia Zweig. And
very quickly, did the president listen to her?
I think he did a lot of the time. Yes, I think he called her basically his right-hand person. And when she spoke, she had a lot of influence over him.
Peter Baker, Reid Epstein of the New York Times, thanks so much for joining us. And coming up next, mayoral candidate Maya Wiley. Less than 3 months to go before the mayoral primary, and it looks like voters aren't paying much attention yet. The Times reports that half of likely Democratic voters are still undecided. The Times quotes the head of the firm that's done one of the few polls as saying, quote, "There is no front runner. It's an open race. We have no idea what's going to happen in the next 3 months. And if history shows us anything, it's that 3 months is an eternity in a New York City election." Maya Wiley is holding her own in the race, coming in third in that poll, which is significant because this election features ranked choice voting. She's a former counsel to Mayor de Blasio, led the city's police oversight agency. You may recognize her from her days as an MSNBC analyst. She picked up a powerful endorsement in February, gaining the backing of the city's biggest union, Local 1199, which represents more than 200,000 healthcare workers. So, what will be on her agenda if she becomes New York City's first woman and only second Black mayor? We're pleased to welcome Maya Wiley to the program. And what do you think is going to change people's minds? We have half of them saying they have no idea who they're going to vote for. So, what's it going to be? What are people looking for in the next mayor?
Well, thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be with you. And let's just start with the recognition that we've lost 31,000 souls in the city to COVID alone, and our economy has been decimated. We probably have closer to 1 million people out of work. That's not the official number, but we know we undercount who is out of work. And, as we know, it's been a really traumatizing, difficult time for everyone in this city. So I'm not surprised that folks have a lot going on and a lot of struggle that is keeping them focused on their families and on making it. But I do think that what that means is, and what I'm feeling and hearing and seeing, is that New Yorkers are looking for a leader who pulls us together and recognizes that we are facing incredible challenges, but challenges that also predated COVID. The challenge that was the affordability crisis in the city, the challenge that was literally the racial justice crisis, which has been a historic and systemic, and the divisions, the spiritual exhaustion from that. And then COVID laid that bare, all those pandemics that preceded it on a bullet train. And so folks are really looking for leadership that is different, that is not the politics of the usual, but really a leader who will be a person for the people. And I come from the people, not from a political machine. And I think that's what people are looking for, a compassionate but sensible leader who puts people first and
One
gets
of the
us back.
one of the big issues in the campaign, obviously, racial justice and also the police department. Do we want to cut, defund, reduce the budget of the police department, or should we put more money into the police department for better training, better relations with the community?
Well, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think we have to start with what keeps us safe. And that means I call it putting the public back into public safety, which is that we have to recognize that, one, we're in an incredible crisis, but that crisis, again, that was a crisis of racial justice as well as a crisis that is COVID, that has shredded our economy. I am the person and the candidate who has sat at that senior cabinet table in City Hall, and I know how hot that kitchen gets, but I also know that what it requires is the power to make tough decisions, but with people engaged in that decision making. And that means we do have to look at what we have to cut out of our budget. We're facing a budget deficit. We should be honest about it. The police department doesn't get a pass. Every single agency has to put 3 to 5% on the table of fat that can be cut. In my plan, I've already said places where I know that the police department has fat. We know it because we have the largest police department in the city and in the country, and we were adding police officers even when we had a peace dividend, where we should have been investing our dollars back into communities to keep them safe, making it easier to get a job than a gun for example, making sure that we had summer youth employment programs for our kids, that we had trauma-informed care. That's investing in public safety. And in my plans, yeah, I'm going to take 18 million out of the police department's budget in order to make sure we have trauma-informed care in our schools where we have high rates of gun violence, because we know that brings violence down 50% and increases graduation rates 20%. That's just spending our precious dollars smartly. But it's also for our caring economy. I'm going to take it out of the next 2 cadet classes scheduled to come into the police department, because we need to invest in our families being able to care for themselves. That is putting the public back in public safety. It is right sizing the police department, because we have the opportunity to focus policing on what we need it to do, which is keep illegal guns off our streets.
Everybody talks about affordable housing. How do we define affordable, and how much affordable housing can we afford?
Yeah. Well, look, we need affordable housing for all the people who need it in the city. And that's a lot of people, right? Whether you earn $70,000 a year or $50,000 a year or $15,000 a year, we need to have housing you can afford without deciding whether you're paying the rent or feeding your family. And that's what's happening in New York City right now. So look, I have a plan called New Deal New York, where I'm not only going to take control of the budget I control, which is the capital construction budget, spend $10 billion to build things we need built and fix things we need fixed. That will not only create 100,000 jobs, and jobs where we will make sure we're doing local hiring from communities that need those jobs the most, the communities hard hit by COVID. But it means that we can do and build more affordable housing. That's part of what we do with our capital construction budget. And we will do it ensuring that all our people can pay the rent and not forego food to do it. So that means, yes, very low and extremely low income New Yorkers need to have the housing at price points they can afford.
Governor signed legislation this week decriminalizing marijuana. Should we decriminalize other drugs as well?
Well, look, I'm starting with supporting that decriminalization of marijuana, because we know that what we are currently doing is sending, but mostly Black and Latino kids to jail for small amounts of marijuana, and that does not make sense, particularly everything we know pharmacologically about marijuana. And what we really need to focus on is the way in which we ensure that our communities that need jobs are not just seen as users, but actually seen as owners in an economy that is created around this decriminalization, because we need to make sure that folks are able to work. We have been criminalizing poverty, and that's what we're going to change here. But I'm certainly, as a mother and as a resident, I want to be very cautious and careful that we're making good public health decisions and good public safety decisions. And that means a process and a conversation. But I'm very much in favor of decriminalizing marijuana.
Mayor de Blasio, for whom you worked, vowed to make New York the fairest big city in the country. Has he succeeded?
Well, look, as we've seen, in cities all over the country, including New York City, no, we have a lot of work to do, and it's tough work. It's hard work, but it is possible work. But what it does require is that we come together. We've become very divided. In my, conversations, both with folks who live in public housing and folks who live with luxury housing, I see a lot of agreement that somehow gets missed in so much of our public discourse. And I want to say this because part of what we can do is create more levels of affordability in housing, is create more jobs, is recognize that our small businesses, particularly small businesses in communities of color that didn't get a dime from our payroll protection program out of the federal government, that didn't get any of the sustenance, as same with our undocumented workers that were essential workers quite often, suffering, not being eligible sufficiently. And I think that's going to change. I hope it does. But that get sufficient investments in being able to afford to feed and support their families. That's why I have a caring economy plan where we will put $5,000 a year as grants for care into the poorest families in the city so that they can care for themselves and their family members, but also create community care centers because care is costly in this city. In fact, it's one of the top 3 costs of living. So when we're looking at making sure we're recovering as a city where we can all live with dignity and remain a diverse city with all of us, it does mean that we're investing in the places that require it. And that means childcare and adult care drop-off centers for quality care that creates care jobs, but also makes sure that families have affordable solutions to ensuring their children and elderly parents or grandparents are well cared for so that they can work, go to doctor's appointments, and do what they need to do.
An answer in about one word. You said the whole point of activism is to fight like hell. What will you fight for most?
I'll fight for people. I'll fight for us to come back as a city that is not just coming back to January 2020. It's that we're coming back together, recognizing that we all deserve investment. And in the communities hardest hit by COVID, where the communities hardest hit by Hurricane Sandy, where the communities hardest hit by the Great Recession. So our recognition has to be, we love this city because it's diverse, because we have everyone. And that's what I'm going to focus on is everyone, 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 and us all.
Thanks to Maya Wiley. Thank you for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.